my quick opening remarks then. But thank you everyone. Thank you, Jose, hosting us on that side. But I just wanted to welcome everybody. My name is Rod Labrador. I'm the newly minted chair of ethnic studies. One of the things I did want to mention with before I let Noel take over, it's my honor to introduce Noel. Noel is one of our founders in our department, recently retired. His book, ﷺaunts Under Influence, was recently listed as an essential book to read about Hawaii by Honolulu Magazine. Don't take my copy, he actually signed this. And so when Noel brought this up to me a couple months ago when we were talking about it, I didn't hesitate to say, let's do this. And in part because we were talking about the importance of what was going on, 60 years ago and the continuing relevance of it. And then for me, it becomes even a little bit more immediate. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Seoul for a conference, and during keynote in the conference, you hear all of these emergency alerts going off, because during the keynote speech at this conference is the alerts about the missiles going off, right? And then you hear just recently the missile in Poland, right? And so how all of these things have really continued to resonate with what was going on and what Noel wants to talk about in the 1960s. But just like his book, this <silence> Ɂaunts Under the Influence, the topic for today has its continuing relevance, right? And I think it really speaks to the kinds of things, the kinds of conversations that we need to continue to have when it comes to what's going on in terms of the military, what's going on with the nuclearization, what's going on in our attempts to create a more just, a more sustainable, a more equal world. And so with that, I'm really excited for Noel to take over and bless us with his knowledge. And so I'll turn it over to you. Thank you, Noel.
Thank you, Rod. I appreciate your kind commentary. Yeah. Very nice. Well, I'm looking at the newspaper. And it says that Russian-made missile kills 2 in Poland. Oh, okay. And we also see that maybe people have learned some lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis, because which was also between the U.S. and Russia, because there's been President Biden has been scrupulously talking about the fact this was a Ukrainian missile, it wasn't a Russian missile, and or other people talk. It may have been, the origin may have been in Russia, but maybe the Russians didn't fire it. There's been a real attempt to, because this is really dangerous stuff. It's if this is a NATO country, Poland, and people have been killed, and theoretically NATO should declare war on people doing this. So this gets very, very creepy. We get back a little bit into Cuban Missile country here. Well, thank you for coming. I thought we would have a nice intimate group, and we do have a very, very intimate group. So that's nice, and there'll be plenty of time for questions or thoughts or comments at some point. And I wanted to thank Jose Brazola and Ruben Campos, Skyer Lewis, and Marcus Figley, and people who did a lot of work to help me out. There's no way I could have done something like this myself, especially technically. There's no way I could do this. So why talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis now? 60th anniversary. Okay, what have we learned? What kind of mistakes have we made over the last 60 years? What have we done of value to try and prevent another crisis like this happening? And we do exist in a very dangerous world, very chaotic world situation. Right now we have what we did have working for us back in 1962 were two leaders, Khrushchev and Kennedy, who basically they made their mistakes and their miscalculations definitely, but they really wanted peace, and they deeply feared this plunge into nuclear war because they realized that millions of people would die and the world would never be the same again. So they understood, and they were sensitive to the kind of outcomes that would happen. Do we have the same thing today? I don't know, especially with someone like Putin, who we don't know about his sanity at this point. He's losing a war which he initiated in order to sort of bring back the glories of the old Soviet Union. He's never forgiven the breakup of the USSR in 1989 and wanted to reconstitute it. And this remains a real problem and a reality for us. But we're also dealing with other. China wasn't really a threat in 1962, and today the Chinese military buildup and economic successes have made China a real powerful player in the world arms race, and especially when the U.S. and China butt heads over the future of Taiwan. Xi would like to see Taiwan annexed to China, believes it's part of their territory, and sees his historic role as reuniting all of what was once China, and that gets very dangerous in the Taiwan Straits of Taiwan, and also in throughout Southeast Asia, and the South China Sea, where there's a lot of various Navy logistics and gymnastics taking place, and seizures of land and all of that. So that has to be watched very carefully also. So once again, there's we're seeing leaders who basically believe they have a historic right to take back territories and to reclaim the glory that was once theirs. And we see the U.S. as more of a status quo power, which wants to maintain the type of relationships that exist and the kind of power relationships that exist. So I mean, there are a number of places that could, very easily blow up in the future, or else threaten to blow up. My personal connection to the 1962 Missile Crisis is that I was an 18-year-old college student, and I was terrified. I thought I was going to die. I really did. And in fact, I think a lot of people, for the first time, a lot of Americans for the first time, thought that they were going to. This was it. This was the end of their lives. And I was sort of thinking to myself, you've never really had a girlfriend, a real girlfriend. You've never really done much, and now you're going to, you're going to die because of the mistakes of all these adults, these crazy world. And I got really shook up. And it wasn't until the third or fourth day of the crisis when the Soviet ships that were headed toward Cuba and were going to run into the American blockade, when they turned back, that I felt like, hey, I've got a possibility of a life, ahead of me. This could really happen. So that was part of it. And of course, 4 or 5 days later, there was the deal, which was able to seal all this. So why don't we and any comments or questions before anybody has any thoughts? Yes.
Where were you when you were 18?
I was in New York, and I remember there was a very New York type of humor going on. And in fact, when people were saying, well, when we all expected to basically die, in the next 24 hours, let's go up to the rooftops and watch the fireworks. That was the sort of New York humor that was going on. And I was that which terrified me even more. And that's sort of it. I think 10 million people in the U.S. Were reported to have left the cities and moved into the countryside, feeling there was this mass migration of people out. my family stayed, I think we were basically fatalistic. We thought, if this comes, it comes, and, do we really want to live in the world after that, it's post atomic world? No, you probably don't want to do that. But, was it Khrushchev who said the living will envy the dead? That's it. And so, why don't we take a look? We've got a film. It's just a 20-minute film, which takes us into the sort of nitty-gritty of what happened in the various generations, and it gives us a chronology. So take a look at this film.
Have we ever shared the screen on it? That's embedded. So do you have the password for this? Yeah. You try asking me the password. Oh.
Sorry, one moment, folks. We didn't notice that this settings on this hadn't been changed.
Jose can also share screen.
Jose, would you be able to share, post this for us? I'll send you the link in the.
Yep, I have the video ready to go. I can just share screen from this end.
Thank you.
So his thought was that we could share on here and see the share on Zoom, so we could all see
Oh,
the raw,
I see.
and we just come back. Or should we just watch it on?
Well, let's see. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're not getting sound. There we are. Never mind.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world has ever come to nuclear apocalypse. An escalating arms race had led to the deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba, which were now prepped and ready to fire on Washington, New York, and almost the entire eastern seaboard. An invasion force of over 120,000 soldiers gathered on the shores of Florida, and almost 3,000 American nuclear weapons were locked onto targets across the Soviet Union. The defining event of the Cold War, it would see the world's leading superpowers fight in a dangerous battle for nuclear superiority, just 90 miles from the American coast. For 13 days in October 1962, American President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev would engage in a battle of wills, where one wrong move could lead to global destruction. Time was ticking, and neither side knew how events were about to unfold. By 1962, Cold War tensions were at an all-time high, with disputes won by the side with the biggest nuclear arsenal. The United States had maintained a significant lead in the arms race since the conflict began, and had already installed Jupiter nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey, all of which were aimed at the Soviet Union. With this advantage, the United States were quickly able to gain the upper hand in any Cold War confrontation, with the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev relying on threats and bluffs to maintain the illusion of control. Things would change in 1959, when communist revolutionary Fidel Castro managed to gain power in Cuba. The communist victory would come as a shock to US officials, as for the last 30 years, Cuba had been a popular holiday destination for wealthy Americans, and by the 1950s,
I paid no electric bills last year. In fact, I was able to make money because I took advantage of this special program that paid me to go solar. And I didn't have to pay a dime out of pocket. It works like this. Solar technology.
1950s, most of the Cuban economy was under American control. However, this would all change when Castro came to power, with American-owned banks, casinos, as well as coffee and sugar plantations, all being nationalized, with Castro eventually turning to the Soviet Union for help and protection. When John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, he was under immense pressure to deal with the Cuban problem, and so launched the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, just 4 months after taking office. 1,500 CIA-trained Cuban exiles invaded the island, with their task to depose Castro and eliminate communism in Cuba. But the invasion would turn out to be a disaster. The exiles found very little support amongst the Cuban people and were quickly trapped by Castro's forces. Wanting to hide American involvement, Kennedy refused to sanction US air support, leading to the invaders surrendering after just 3 days. It was an embarrassing start to Kennedy's presidency. Castro's victory in Cuba was equally as important for Khrushchev. As well as gaining a new ally in the Western Hemisphere, Khrushchev would also develop a deep affection for Castro himself, later stating that he thought of him like a son. Deciding that it was only a matter of time before Kennedy attempted another invasion of Cuba, Khrushchev decided to deploy nuclear missiles to the island in 1962, insisting on complete secrecy. If all went to plan, he would fly to Havana, the capital of Cuba, once the missiles were installed, to announce a formal defense agreement with Castro, forming a united front against the Americans. In order to maintain complete secrecy, the Soviet troops sent to the island were crammed beneath the deck of cargo and transport ships, where there was barely enough space to lie down. The soldiers themselves had no idea where they were heading, and were told to wear civilian clothes once they arrived to avoid detection. Accompanying the transport ships were 4 Soviet submarines, each of which carried a small nuclear-tipped torpedo. But conditions on the submarines were even worse than on the transport ships. As the submarines entered tropical waters, each 78-man crew would have to deal with temperatures as high as 140 degrees Fahrenheit, or 60 degrees Celsius. The crews suffered from extreme dehydration and nausea, made worse by the dangerously high levels of carbon dioxide and the constant smell of diesel. But for now, they had managed to avoid US intelligence, and Khrushchev's great missile gamble was looking successful. They would learn, Khrushchev stated, just what it feels like to have enemy missiles pointing at you. We'd be doing nothing more than giving them a little taste of their own medicine. It would take over a month for American U-2 spy planes to first spot the missiles. On October 16th, the CIA would present Kennedy with a series of photographs of the unfinished missile sites, with important elements labeled for easy identification. It was soon determined that they were dealing with medium-range ballistic missiles, capable of hitting targets at a distance of almost 1,200 miles. Launched from Cuba, they would be capable of delivering a nuclear strike on Florida, New York, and even the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., in just 13 minutes, causing millions of civilian casualties. To help guide him through the crisis, Kennedy would set up XCOM, a group of his most influential and trusted advisors. As the group debated, it soon became clear that Kennedy had 2 options open to him. He could either set up a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent further Soviet shipments from arriving, or he could use airstrikes to take out the missile sites before they could be completed. After days of debate, Kennedy would decide that the blockade was the better option. It was far less likely to provoke a conflict and would open the way for negotiation. On October 22nd, over 100 million Americans would tune into the television and watched Kennedy announce the discovery of the missiles and his plans to implement a naval blockade of Cuba.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Almost 5,000 miles across the world, Khrushchev was deciding how to respond to Kennedy's announcement. He was glad that the president had shown restraint and had decided not to invade. The Soviet soldiers stationed in Cuba were equipped with short-range nuclear missiles to use in the event of a US invasion. If Kennedy had decided to invade, a full-scale nuclear war would have almost certainly followed. With Kennedy implementing a naval blockade of Cuba, Khrushchev now had to decide what to do with the Soviet ships still at sea. While almost all of the first shipments had arrived in Cuba, a more powerful group of intermediate-range missiles was still halfway across the Atlantic. He could either back down now and face an embarrassing retreat, or call the Americans' bluff and continue to push ahead. As Khrushchev debated the issue, panic would begin to spread in the United States. The stock exchange was tanking, and many shops suddenly found themselves emptied out in a wave of panic buying. People could only sit at home and watch as news came in of Soviet ships creeping closer and closer to the blockade. Finally, on the morning of October 24th, 2 days after Kennedy's announcement, news would come in that the first Soviet ship had turned around and began sailing back home. Kennedy's gamble had paid off. There would be no more Soviet missiles arriving in Cuba. Upon hearing the news, Secretary of State Dean Rusk would famously state, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. But the crisis would continue. As the missile sites neared completion, each side would begin to prepare for war. The Strategic Air Command would move to DEFCON 2 for the first time in history, just one step short of nuclear war. It commanded almost 3,000 nuclear weapons and had a B-52 Stratofortress taking off from US air bases every 20 minutes.
A house or a laptop? Which one do you think is worth more? Well, definitely not the house, because it not only costs millions to buy, but you also have to pay thousands to maintain it every month.
Each carrying enough destructive power to take out 4 Soviet cities. The US invasion plan of Cuba was also nearing completion, with top generals pressuring Kennedy to authorize the attack. Codenamed Operation Scabbards, the invasion called for a series of massive airstrikes, followed by a paratrooper drop and an amphibious landing of 120,000 troops, almost the size of the D-Day landings at the end of World War II. As these troops began to arrive in Florida, the state came to resemble a war zone. Machine gun nests and barbed wire littered the beaches, and armed soldiers patrolled the streets. The Casa Marina Hotel was turned into an army headquarters, and the CIA set up safe houses in the surrounding area, where Cuban exiles were prepared to be used as an infiltration force. War was fast approaching, but on the evening of October 26th, the first signs of a diplomatic solution would appear. Kennedy would receive an unexpected letter from Khrushchev outlining the potential terms of a deal. If the United States ended the blockade and promised not to invade Cuba, then Khrushchev would be willing to withdraw his troops. But the members of ExCom were skeptical. Many were keen to invade, while others were unwilling to accept any compromise that could be seen as a sign of weakness. Negotiation would have to wait. The crisis would come to a head on October 27th, 1962, a day that would come to be known as Black Saturday. On this day, a series of incredibly dangerous events would take place, any one of which could have led to a nuclear war. The day would begin with Castro composing a letter to Khrushchev, urging him to consider a nuclear first strike against the United States. He had become utterly convinced that an American invasion was imminent and wanted his Soviet allies to deliver the first blow. Unlike Castro, Khrushchev still believed there was time for negotiation. He would send a second proposal to Kennedy, this time specifying what he would accept in a deal. Khrushchev agreed to remove his missiles from Cuba, if Kennedy would do the same with the American Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Wanting to bypass the slow diplomatic process, Khrushchev would instead broadcast his message over Radio Moscow for the world to hear. When Kennedy heard the proposal, he knew it was a fair deal. The Jupiter missiles were secretly considered obsolete, with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara describing them as a pile of junk. Yet there was significant resistance within EXCOM. The Turkish government was opposed to the deal, and it was argued that trading away the missiles would significantly weaken the power of NATO and lead to further demands from Khrushchev. If Kennedy wanted to accept the deal, he would have to stand alone against his advisors. American spy plane pilot Rudolph Anderson would then enter Cuban airspace. As he began photographing the missile sites, he would draw the attention of Soviet air defenses, who would label him target number 33. The Soviet forces had been in a state of high alert for a number of days, being convinced by Castro that an American invasion was imminent. Anderson's plane was particularly troubling, as it had flown over the missile site targeting Guantanamo Bay. If allowed to leave, the Americans would have in-depth knowledge of Soviet positions, paving the way for targeted airstrikes. Deciding it was too dangerous to let the spy plane escape, the order was dispatched to destroy target number 33. 2 missiles were fired, with Anderson being killed upon impact. The crisis had claimed its first casualty. Back in Washington, time was running out. The military were calling for massive airstrikes against Cuba by Monday morning at the latest, and news was starting to come in that Anderson's plane had been shot down. At this crucial moment, Kennedy would turn to the one person he could truly trust, his brother, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy. With the help of presidential speechwriter Ted Sorensen, Bobby would draft a reply to Khrushchev that attempted to merge all the different ideas EXCOM had. In exchange for the removal of the missiles, the United States would be willing to make a pledge not to invade Cuba. The removal of the Jupiter missiles in Turkey was also part of the deal, but this would have to remain a secret to avoid offending America's NATO allies. Khrushchev would just have to trust that the president would stick to his word. This was Kennedy's last hope. If the deal was rejected, he would have no choice but to go to war. As Bobby was delivering the message to the Soviet ambassador, an incredibly dangerous confrontation would occur in the Atlantic. The US Navy had been making an intense effort to find the 4 Soviet submarines since the crisis began, and had finally closed in on them. They planned to use signaling depth charges to drive the submarines to the surface, whose harmless explosions would act as a warning. The Soviet submarine B-59 had been chased by US forces for the last 2 days, with the already unbearable conditions on board having gotten worse. The ventilation system had shut down, with temperatures rising to unbearable heights, and high levels of carbon dioxide, causing many officers to faint while on duty. The disoriented crew would be shaken by wave after wave of deafening explosions as US ships began dropping signaling depth charges directly on top of them. The submarine's crew had been unable to contact Moscow for over 24 hours, and as far as they were aware, World War III could have broken out while they were under the waves. Tired and exhausted, the submarine's captain would order nuclear torpedoes to be launched, believing that war had already begun. But the decision required the approval of all onboard officers. One of the officers, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to go through with the launch, single-handedly preventing the outbreak of nuclear war.
Check this out. I'm going to show you how I afforded this car. Okay, you ready? All right, 100.
As night came on October 27th, no one knew what the next day would hold. The crisis had claimed its first casualty. A nuclear launch had been narrowly avoided in the Atlantic, and both Fidel Castro and the US military were pressing for war. The power to end the crisis now lay with Khrushchev. He could either swallow his pride and accept Kennedy's terms, or push for further concessions and risk provoking war. But Khrushchev had decided long ago that he would have to retreat. As Kennedy's message came in, promising to remove the Jupiter missiles, Khrushchev finally had terms he could work with, and that morning he would broadcast his acceptance of the deal on Radio Moscow, bringing an end to the crisis. The Soviet forces in Cuba were ordered to dismantle the missiles and return them home, with the last leaving the island 2 weeks later. The blockade was formally ended on November 20th, with the Jupiter missiles, as promised, being discreetly dismantled 5 months later. While Kennedy and Khrushchev were both relieved, others were less happy. Castro was furious that a deal had taken place behind his back and would begin to doubt the resolve of his Soviet allies. The US military, who had been pushing for an invasion since the crisis began, were also critical of the deal, with General Curtis LeMay describing the deal as the greatest defeat in American history. The Cuban Missile Crisis would have a significant effect on the Cold War. Having come so close to nuclear apocalypse, both superpowers would take steps to ensure that a similar crisis could never happen. Communication had been particularly poor during the crisis, with Khrushchev's first letter taking almost 12 hours to reach the president. A hotline would soon be installed between the White House and the Kremlin to ensure good communication if another crisis occurred. Never again would the most powerful leaders in the world have to communicate through the sole use of handwritten letters and radio broadcasts.
It's a pretty heavy history here. Yeah.
I was wondering what your thoughts were on like what we can learn from Cuba, because I think the documentary was a little unfair to Cuba. Because well, I mean, first of all, Castro wasn't a Marxist. I mean, at least when he started the revolution, he wasn't a Marxist. He would become a Marxist like after U.S. like Cuban relationship like deteriorated. But I guess it's kind of like it doesn't really kind of the documentary didn't really go into kind of the stakes the Cubans are facing at the time of like the nuclear crisis where I mean they mentioned the Bay of Pigs, but like the US was bombing Cuba. And so, you know, Cubans were already in a state of war at the time of the missile crisis. And so, and also like, you know, and also like the Cubans were really ultimately kind of left out of the kind of the major big discussions that took place between Khrushchev and Kennedy. And so, yeah, I was wondering if what your thoughts were on like what, you know, today we can learn from what was, you know, the Cubans themselves.
Well, you know, the history of the United States and Latin America is it's a pretty sordid history of supporting dictators, of supporting interests that will give American companies special privileges in Cuba. You know, I mean, in Cuba before Castro, the U.S. controlled sugar, they controlled oil, they controlled the export economy, mining. You know, it was basically an American satellite. You know, we used to talk about Czechoslovakia and Poland being Russian satellites, but you know the U.S. is doing the same thing in Latin America and other places too. Central America was even worse. And when people revolted to try to establish more progressive and democratic governments, these were overthrown very often by the CIA. Talking about the Arbenz government in Guatemala in 1954, which was not a communist government, even though it was called communist by John Foster Dulles and the people around Eisenhower, but it was targeted as being communist. And this gets into a larger story, which is the sort of obsession with communism that Americans had for many years. You know, from 1945. When the honeymoon with Russia, the ally, turned into, Russia, the predatory country. And part of that is a real history in the sense that the Soviets imposed a very harsh, very mean, very brutal regime, set of regimes on Czechoslovakia and other countries, Poland and other countries. In 1968, they overthrew the Czech government, which was, moving away from Moscow. They demanded complete control. And so I mean, you got a situation in which the U.S. policy becomes one of containment, starting with Truman in 1947, and then moving on through Eisenhower and Dulles and others. And Kennedy inherited that, and he probably would have been perhaps more cordial or more understanding toward the new regime in Cuba had he not had to face fire from Republicans who were denouncing him and others. It was a very difficult situation. Lyndon Johnson once said, "Yeah, you tell me to leave Vietnam, but if I leave Vietnam, the Republicans are going to kick my ass." I mean that's what he said. So it was very difficult to have a sort of principled political position in that sort of situation. In fact, when Kennedy came to office in 1961, he attempted to start an Alianza por Progreso, the Alliance for Progress, which was an attempt to break with historic U.S. Exploitation and in Latin America, and start a new way of a wholly new relationship based on some degree of equality and equity. And that didn't go very far. And in fact, after his death, that was completely abandoned. But you get by 1965, you find the invasion of the Dominican Republic by Johnson and that sort of thing. So we're going back to the gunboat diplomacy that we had always used. So Cuba, Castro was a reaction to that, and I agree. I don't think Castro was probably a left winger who, and also somewhat of an opportunist who basically understood that unless he fortifies his revolution, the U.S. would destroy it. And the U.S. had already broken, economic ties and denied the Cubans their sugar quota, and things like this, which were an attempt to destroy. And then the Bay of Pigs comes along, which was an outright attempt to destroy the revolution. So, I mean, and Che was probably more of a, dyed-in-the-wool sort of communist than Fidel was. But Fidel said, if we want to maintain the revolution, then we need to have the support of a very powerful outside force, and that would be the Soviets. And then he felt betrayed by what happened here that we see, because Fidel was in this bizarre position of advocating a nuclear war rather than see Khrushchev make a deal, which was also would have been totally destructive, not only to Cuba but to the rest of mankind or humankind. So that's what we're dealing. This is a very tough situation, and Kennedy was in tremendous pressure by the military and others, not by Robert McNamara, but by people like Curtis LeMay, who was sort of a nutcase of a SAC commander. If people remember Curtis LeMay, know about Curtis LeMay. I mean, he basically wanted a full-scale attack on Cuba and also the Soviet Union, which would that would have been a good World War. And then you have even people like Maxwell Taylor, who were sort of more respected as military figures. They wanted an invasion of Cuba, and they wanted to hit the missile sites, which again would have sparked the war. And and Kennedy, at the end of his, he has this comment just before he died. He says, "The first advice that I'm going to give my successor is to watch the generals. They are mostly men whose opinion on military matters are worth a damn." So Kennedy also has said that if six of my main advisors were in power, we would have had a world war. So we're fortunate that we had him and Robert, able to intercede, and they had the power to basically call the play and to accept Khrushchev's and then Robert Kennedy, of course, rewrote the Khrushchev letter in a sense, and then they applied secrecy when they had to. They basically didn't reveal that they were scrapping the Cuban missiles, which would have caused a real furor among Republicans and others. So
those were the missiles in Turkey. Correct?
Those were the missiles in Turkey and Italy, that they were going to take out because they weren't useful anyway. So let's take them out. So this was Kennedy was very, very skillful in negotiating this and to resisting this tremendous pressure to just hit Cuba and hit the Russians and bring on this catastrophe. The estimate was that if the World War had taken place, something in the order of 50 million Americans would have been killed, and probably 280 million Russians and Chinese. I mean, that's astonishing. That's just horrendous. So, okay, in terms of lessons, let me just, are there any lessons?
We have a question from Dr. Hallett.
Yeah.
Yeah, hello. I'm Brian Hallett. I teach in the Matsunaga Institute for Peace. I was a senior in high school in 62. And I was very busy playing soccer and trying to complete my assignments. So I wasn't very aware of the Cuban Missile Crisis. At that time, I didn't watch the news or read the newspapers or anything. But to introduce some ambiguity into the history, Curtis LeMay was a very, very, as Noel just said, right? As the film just said, he was a very, very strong proponent of invading Cuba. And he would have gone, as Noel also said, the next step and attacked the Soviet Union. If anybody, well, they didn't have to ask him because he told them, right? However, there's an oral history that the Air Force did with General LeMay after he retired, which is what they do, of course. And the strange thing that LeMay said in the oral interview was that he never was in doubt that there would not be a nuclear war. So that the crisis from his point of view was about getting to Cuba as quickly as possible and getting control of the missiles that were there, and possibly, you know, attacking the Soviet Union itself. But he didn't think that that this would escalate to a nuclear. He wanted war, but not a nuclear war. And the reason that he said this is that whereas the United States put its missiles and bomber aircraft, as they said in the film, on alert, the Soviets never did. And at that time, in 62, the Soviet missiles were still liquid fueled missiles. And it takes a day or so in order to fuel up the missiles. So it's a very long, you know, technically difficult process to put the liquid hydrogen and whatnot into the missiles. So Curtis LeMay was of the opinion that a nuclear war was never on the table, because Khrushchev had never given the order to fuel up his missiles. And therefore Khrushchev couldn't have started one. It would have taken him 2 or 3 days to do that. So on the one hand, it's very, very clear that this is, I mean, it was a crisis, right? And it's perhaps the closest that we've come to a nuclear exchange. But it's not absolutely clear that we were actually at the brink. And this is, this was the foundation of Curtis LeMay's vigorous encouragement to Kennedy that he should strike. He should strike not only in Cuba, but also in the Soviet Union. So I think that introduces a little bit of ambiguity into the situation. Anyway, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Brian. That's a very, very good point you make about LeMay. Just in terms of what are some of the lessons that we learn as we deal with the crisis that we have, today. One is at the nuclear threshold, when there's talk about nukes as there are today, in Ukraine, lower officers can possibly start a war by themselves, that leaders cannot always control events, in fact, are shut out from, really critical intelligence. And secondly, leaders can misunderstand each other. Khrushchev, when he launched this whole campaign to put rockets in nuclear missiles in Cuba, basically he never imagined that he never thought the U.S. is going to object to this. I mean, this is 90 miles from Florida, the backyard, the U.S. backyard, an area that the U.S. had always regarded as an extension of the United States or Florida. And Kennedy himself was basically, after reports began coming in September about all these huge transports that were dropping off materials from Russia to Cuba, he never really bothered to think, what's really going on. And then when the missiles started coming in, he basically accepted the idea that when there was proof, that these are probably defensive. So, leaders can misunderstand the situation, even when they're very bright and very concerned. People like Kennedy. There's also intelligence has its limits in terms of the I mean, the intelligence community can make all kinds of recommendations and evaluations of the situation. That can be wrong also. So they can mislead each other, and there could be all kinds of failures at various levels, all kinds of misunderstandings that today we have much better communications, instantaneous communications than they had there. But it possibly can't work also with given these miscalculations. There's a lot of secrecy that basically undermines the ability of. And one of the things I'm glad to see about the what's happening with today is there's more. When Biden meets Xi, they both basically say, one says, I want you to keep your hands off Taiwan, and the other says Taiwan's part of. So I mean, there is a definite, it's very, very definitely clear what the long-term objectives of both are, and that's positive. Kennedy's understanding at the end of the crisis, and by the way, he became a national hero for taking the stand and resisting the Russians and basically forcing the Russians to back down on this. He became a national hero, and he and Khrushchev worked very closely together to build a regime against testing in the atmosphere in 1963. So I mean, something very positive did come out of this whole thing. But Kennedy's basic takeaway was that quote unquote, peace is the necessary rational policy for rational men. And that Kennedy believed that the presence of nuclear weapons would always be a threat to the survival of the human species. And that was his takeaway from all this. I mean, he was really horrified by what had happened. In a sense, Khrushchev was also horrified because he basically, the tone of his, in the year and a half that he had, 2 years he had left, in power, he basically adopted a much more conciliatory position toward the Americans. So the leaders themselves were really chastened by being, if they weren't at the brink, they were near the brink in a way that nobody had been before. Yeah, but I think even the way that the U.S. has handled this this whole question of these rockets that landed in Poland this week and killed a number of Poles, and obviously this is probably a place close to where the Poles have been gathering supplies for the Ukrainians. And they were very quick to say, hey, wait a minute, this is no, we don't have any evidence that all this came from Russia, or that it did come from Russia. It was Russian made. There may have been a Ukrainian rocket that hit it and deviated it in its course. I mean, so they were they understood that this could really blow up very quickly into an issue where it was NATO against Russia. And, there were talks of a much wider war. So that's, I think, very positive. I was relieved to see that in the news.
May I ask
Yes, please.
I just want to share my own personal experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was 10 years old.
And you're
Michael Sukkot.
Okay, Michael.
Yeah, I'm connected with West Oahu campus.
Okay.
I was 10 years old. I remember sitting in our apartment in the Bronx in New York City with the TV on. I seem to remember being alone, or if there were no adults there. And I was watching this unfold in real time, and it scared the hell out of me. And I understood what it meant if we had gone to a nuclear war. So I'm just, as a counterpoint to the other gentleman who just spoke, I remember it extremely clearly. And it scared the hell out of me, and it stayed with me ever since. Ever since. It was a formative part of my consciousness. And I mean, that's a lot of what brought me here.
When you were our age at the time, you didn't realize you could die. I mean, you
At what age?
I was 18 at the time, but it was, I just thought, you sort of think you're gonna live forever. You thought,
I
you just
didn't think that
improve
way
yourself.
10 years
Well,
ago.
I thought that way.
Yeah.
And then that was a rude awakening to me. No.
Yeah, yeah.
You are vulnerable, man.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, thank you, man. Yeah. Any other Kapuna here who want to share their reactions to the missile crisis?
Well, I'm another old timer. I was in high school in 1962. And the most vivid memory I have was watching Kennedy's speech, one where he said any missile launched from Cuba would be viewed as an attack by the Soviet Union on the US and require the full retaliatory response. That was pretty chilling. The other comment I wanted to make is there's a recent book out, The Bomb by Fred Kaplan, that deals with lessons that people have learned about nuclear crises. And he documents that various people in new administrations come in and they thought there must be a better way of dealing with nuclear weapons than having a all-out exchange. And so they tried to devise strategies and weapons that would actually be usable. And as a result of doing studies and doing war games, the almost universal conclusion is that you cannot keep control. And there are examples of that in the Cuban Missile Crisis. If this officer on the Soviet submarine hadn't stopped them from launching the nuclear armed torpedo, things rapidly could have escalated completely out of control of Kennedy or Khrushchev. And that seems to be the lesson that's been learned in subsequent administrations.
One lesson we didn't seem to learn was the notion that, Walter Lippmann once wrote that the only people in the world who don't think the United States has an empire are Americans. And that's, that's one thing when you have empires and empires are clashing, and right now it's the US empire and the Chinese empire and the Russian, there are going to be situations like this that are really deadly. When you look at the US military budget of $840 billion a year, plus, the bases we have around the world and the level of armaments, and it's, there's going to be all that.
There's another raised hand.
Yes, we have 2 raised hands, and then we had a question also from Charles Carter earlier had a question about if you could explain mutual assured destruction and has it worked? I don't know who wants to take that one. Brian.
Yeah. Well, mutual assured destruction has worked perfectly. And the reason it has worked perfectly is because every morning I get up and I say a prayer that nobody will start a nuclear exchange. This is the same problem with deterrence, right? That there's no way to demonstrate that deterrence is deterring until it fails. So that it's a key. Deterrence is use by non-use. So we're going to use the nuclear bombs to deter somebody somewhere. But we're not going to use them. So it's a contradiction. It doesn't make any sense. And you can go whistling in the dark for a very, very long time, saying, we're deterring the North Vietnamese. We're deterring the North Vietnamese. We're deterring Saddam Hussein. We're deterring the Iranians. We're deterring everybody and as long as you say that, you can convince yourself that that's what you're doing. But there's no evidence. There's no evidence. So mutually assured destruction, to be more specific, is Robert McNamara's idea that if we can assure the Soviet Union that when the Soviet Union strikes the United States first and destroys the United States, we will still have the capacity on a second strike to destroy the Soviet Union. So the Soviets attacking the United States on a first strike is not going to end the situation, because we are assured that on the second strike, we'll come back and destroy them. Yeah. And it's mutually assured destruction, right? So the idea is that the Soviets will not launch the nuclear attack first, because they know that that in response, they will be assuredly destroyed. And of course, it sounds good. And you can repeat it to yourself and feel good. Before I turn it over to Sam Pooley, I'd like to make one point about lessons learned. The lesson we did not learn in Cuba is that what we need is unilateral nuclear disarmament by the United States. Mm-hmm. So which country was the first country to develop and use these nuclear devices? So we're the leaders, right? We've always been the leaders. We were the leader in putting it on missiles. We were leader on the multiple warheads. We were the leader on the hydrogen bomb. We were the leader in every instance. So is what we have to do is we have to lead. We have to be the first to unilaterally get rid of these bombs because they can't be used. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is a primary example of how they can't be used. I mean, why didn't we use them? Why did Khrushchev not fuel his missiles, fuel the Soviet missiles? Because you can't use them. They can't use them. Sam has his hand up.
Okay, I guess Brian has called on me. Thank you. So I've been thinking about these the world consequences of this, and Brian makes a good point that those of us from the United States who've gone to Japan, gone to Hiroshima and to Nagasaki, have a sense of the angst from our side, which can't possibly mirror the emotions on the Japanese side. But those of us during the Cuban Missile Crisis who were young, and I think I was a bit younger than almost all of you who've spoken, there's this existential uncertainty that has warped our emotions and our psychology for quite in many ways ever since. And so one of the questions back to Noel is, what are the lessons for the current generation of college students and high school students, maybe, and maybe younger, if they are absorbing the similar kind of threat based on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the nuclear standoff between the US, NATO, and Russia over that invasion? In other words, what's the younger generation to make of this?
My sense is that Russia and the Ukraine, as it has in the past, is operating out of a situation of real weakness. I mean, some people have described Russia as a third world country with a very powerful military force. And in fact, Khrushchev felt the same way. They always felt distinctly inferior to the United States. There's this great story about Khrushchev in his 1959 visit to the United States where impulsively, as he always did, he rushed into the supermarket. And when he came out, he just, you know, he had this terribly depressed look because he finally realized that the Russians were, you know, who couldn't even produce enough meat or enough milk for their population at that time. They were never they couldn't compete. The Cold War was over already, you know, economically, they were defeated. And so you get this huge amount of investment in putting up satellites in the sky and other things like this in order to create a sense of national euphoria in the Soviet Union and to intimidate people in the US. In fact, we were intimidated. I don't know if people remember the Sputnik, how many people remember the Sputnik? Some of us do. And, you know, we saw this thing up in the sky that was 1957 that's floating around. And we're wondering, hey, that's a Russian. That's the Russians doing that. It's not us. I mean, does that mean they're ahead of us in the space race? And if they can put it up there, maybe they can send rockets over here. So, I mean, it worked at one level as a great propaganda tool, but it just was another indication of Soviet weakness. I mean, and in fact, there was no great, you know, the Russians were out of it almost from the beginning, you know, from 1945 on, and, which is why they acted so brutally in so many places, you know, in Eastern Europe, you know, places. Yeah. Any other thoughts that people have, or questions or comments from anybody here? Oh, another question?
Someone's hand is raised.
Charles, you can go ahead.
Just wanted to share after those that shared their experience of being in high school and at that time and the effect it had on them. I was actually a soldier in the Army on a nuclear missile site in South Florida during and after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the impact it had on me was that we were prepared. We were full of piss and vinegar, said bring it on, and all of the things that 17 and 18-year-old soldiers do during things like that. But along with many others, we were highly trained. We were stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas, as a strategic Army command or STRAC unit that trained to be deployed with our missiles anywhere in the world within 72 hours. So we got orders on October the 25th. I still have a copy of those orders. October the 25th, 1962, to deploy to South Florida, which we did. And we were set up in just a few days with anti-aircraft missiles, the Nike Hercules. And so our experience was based on what we saw from earlier generations coming back from World War II, although I was born in 1945 and the war was over in 1945. But during my earlier years, 5 and 6 years old, I saw a lot of my relatives coming or that had served in World War II. They were now going off to Korea. And so we were very patriotic, and it was a totally different perspective on you're being a part of something. You would serve in the military. It was just sort of what most of the men did at that time. And so it was a very positive experience. We were scared as hell, like the rest of you talked about. But when we were on the ground doing our duty with our missiles raised in a higher DEPCON level, knowing that we were the very first anti-aircraft site that the bombers would come over from Cuba if they decided to, and we would be their first targets. But for some reason, we didn't let that affect us. We actually put the latitude and longitude coordinates of Castro's palace in Cuba. We wrote it on the end of our missiles, so we were always enjoying having fun, but we never really had the fear that we could die just within moments or anything. But it was more of a positive experience. I think because we grew up very fearful of Russia parachuting in hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers and taking over our schools, our churches, our communities. And we grew up with that and we were in fear of that. So I think it was our way as young men to be able to possibly do something about that. So that was my experience, and I just wanted to kindly share it, a little different perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Any, as we get to the end, was any final thoughts or just?
I had a quick question. Because when I was in Seoul, people were talking about having emergency alert fatigue, right? So I was wondering what you think about with all of this. We get so much information, we see all of this thing that we have information from everywhere. How is like this proliferation of social media and everything, how is that affecting what's our experience now versus what you folks experienced in 1962, right? And the kind of impact that it has. Because as when I was at this conference, all these alarms are going off and people were just kind of like, okay, fine. You know, oh, there's missiles coming, there's an earthquake, there's something, and then all of these things were happening. But then we were like, I guess the keynote speaker would just kept on going. Like nothing, and the rest of us were kind of freaked out, but everybody else seemed to be like, oh, it's okay, that's a normal kind of thing for us.
Any thoughts on that?
What makes you think what's normal?
Yeah. Yeah.
What's normality?
In a sense, we were more focused back in '62. I mean, you know, we had one source of news, basically, Walter Cronkite, you know, on CBS or whatever. And it was, you know, so it wasn't like dozens of things were competing for our attention. And, you know, and it was a different world, yeah. And maybe the focus it was good to have that kind of focus. You know, it brought us together in some fashion. I really like Brian's idea about you know, beginning to a build down of nuclear weapons and scrapping a lot of them. I think that's, if we have a future, that's where the future is. You know, Brian, anything else you want to say about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the primary lesson that I would take away from well, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Cuban Missile Crisis, is that you know, these things are useless. You know, all they can do is just blow us all up, right? You know, the terrible thing about the nuclear explosives is that they just don't injure the other side. You know, it boomerangs back, right? And at a certain level, you get the nuclear winter phenomenon, which would make climate change, you know, sound like a good idea. So, I mean, if you go into your closet and you find something that you haven't used for 20, 30 years, you probably consider that thing to be useless. And what do you do with useless things? What do you do with useless things? You get rid of it.
Yeah, it's useless, but we don't get rid of it. And since we proliferate it, I mean,
right.
Compare the number of nuclear powers today to where it was in '62. I mean, you know, not only North Korea, but you've got India, Pakistan, you've got Israel, you've got all these nuclear located in zones of extreme political tension, which makes it even worse, and which they may be useless, but we seem to need them. We seem to need atomic weapons to.
Well, you know,
we don't need them. We don't need them, but because it makes life even more dangerous and makes us more vulnerable. But you know, we keep building them. We keep,
Yeah. Yeah.
proliferating them.
I mean, you have to have sympathy for the North Koreans and the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Israelis. We've been telling them since 1945 that these things are absolutely necessary for the American defense. Well, if they're absolutely necessary for the Americans, they must be absolutely necessary for the North Koreans, right? So instead of emphasizing that these things are useless, we've been propagandizing the rest of the world that somehow they're useful. And the rest of the world believes us. You know, you shouldn't believe Americans on stuff like this. You know, so, you know, the lesson not learned is that we need to get rid of them. Michael, you have your hand up?
Yes, I just wanted to say, well, a couple of things. First of all, they're not useless. They're being used by our government to hold the whole world hostage, along with the Soviet Union. This was never a democratic decision. So what is this about our democracy? Number two, forgot what the third point is. Oh yeah, about we. I always have a problem using the term we because it's too inclusive. Who is we? That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, is it okay if I ask that question in relation to your point? Because I was thinking about what you were making in a comment earlier about what the government often does without the consent of the government. And so I was thinking the government is oftentimes, their decisions are a physical manifestation of the elite and the rich, the powerful in the state. And so I often wonder when it comes to world crises in relation to nuclear war, does the rich like represent the same thing as what the poor want in like when it comes to nuclear war, do the bodies of rich people like are they the same as the bodies of the poor people within society? Like are we, when we talk about American civilians in the context of who makes the decisions, are we talking about everyone? Or are we talking about the elite? That's what I was wondering about. If like in times of world crisis, like does class consciousnness kind of dissipate? Does class disappear when we're talking about it? When we're talking about who's impacted, who are the victims? That's just what I was thinking about.
I think you answered your own question.
Thank you.
And ultimately, the elites will be vulnerable too. I mean, everybody is going to, you know, die in them if we want. So, yeah. And in 62, lots of people decamped from the cities and tried to take refuge in places they thought were safe. But is anybody safe? That's the question. Okay. So, any conclusions to this, or you know? But I think Brian has raised a very good point about the necessity to really challenge the whole necessity for nuclear weapons, you know, and the dangers they pose, and trying to build down, eliminate them ultimately. That would be a good thing to do. A very good thing to do. Yeah. Thank you all for your participation, and this has been a really fruitful session. And, come back.
Thanks for doing this, Noel.
Thank you, Noel.
Thanks,
everybody.
Yes.
Thanks.